American rail network began as a collection of short lines, rarely with any through running. Many preferred to see the railways as a short-distance route to cater to local needs. Bigger companies, facilitating long-distance transport, would make better profits skipping over the small towns, leaving them unable to take full advantage of the railway. But for big businesses, there was money to be made if larger routes could be built. And a project was shaping up that would change the outlook of rail planning. The Erie Railroad was envisioned as a means of linking New York with Lake Erie, eliminating the monopoly enjoyed by the Erie Canal. It was founded in 1832, but it would take almost 20 years to see fruit. It ran into a series of issues, both technical and financial. For instance, it was believed that the rough ground could best be crossed by building the line on piles. More than 100 miles, 160 kilometres of these wooden piles were driven into the ground before it was realised that the foundations were too unstable, and a more conventional track needed to be built alongside them. The strains on the company's finances proved immense, and they were forced to file for bankruptcy 5 times over the course of the construction. At one point, they were saved only by a successful appeal to the New York state government, who not only agreed to write off $3 million in loans they had acquired, but also to create an additional $3 million in loans to boost the project. The line was built to a 6-foot or 1.829 metre gauge, as it was believed that this would be superior for long-range transport. This allowed for larger engines, but produced a lot of compatibility and maintenance issues. At Taruka Creek, they built the Taruka Viaduct, at the time the largest rail viaduct in the world. 100 feet, 30 metres high, with 17 spans of 50 feet, 15 metres wide. The line finally opened in 1851. For a brief time, this was the longest railway in the world. The Erie Railroad greatly boosted trade across the state, cementing New York as the foremost port on the East Coast, and proving the value of long-distance rail travel. One other important innovation on the line was to show the full use of the telegraph system. Telegraph lines have been running alongside many American railways since the Baltimore and Ohio had installed them in 1843. They allowed rail companies to pass information rapidly over long distances, while the telegraph companies had a quick means of travelling the line to perform inspections and maintenance. But most rail crews viewed the telegraph as a novelty, preferring to rely on what they could see. When the Erie's chief superintendent Charles Minow had persuaded the company to install telegraph poles, they were initially viewed by many as unnecessary. But Minow could see the potential of the system, and was annoyed that crews were not taking full advantage. He would soon get a chance to prove his point. In 1851, he was seated in a westbound train from Turner's Station, but saw that there was a delay. The line was single-tracked, and the only passing loops were at the stations. Minow's train was due to wait for an eastbound train to pass them there, but there was no sign of it from the lookouts. Annoyed to find that no one was using the telegraph to find out more, Minow marched into the telegraph office and ordered them to contact the next station to see if the eastbound train had passed there yet. Finding that it hadn't, he ordered the next station to expect his train first, and to hold the eastbound train if it arrived there before them. He then ordered his own train on, but the driver refused, unwilling to trust his life to a newfangled technology. Minow took over the footplate himself, ordering the driver to ride upon the cushions. The driver took a seat in the rearmost carriage, fearing a head-on collision. But the train did not collide, and reached the next station to find that the eastbound train had still not arrived there. Minow telegraphed ahead once more, and found that the eastbound train had not reached the next station either, so he ordered his train on once more. In total, he did this 4 times in a row, before finally passing the train everyone had been insisting on waiting for at the first station. Minow's impatience made a public spectacle, which proved the value of the telegraph to the railways, allowing information to be transmitted long distance. Directors and signallers could know where every train was at any given time, giving them a much more strategic overview from which to make decisions. The success of the Erie Railroad led the way for many similar long-distance rail projects. These became known as big trunk routes, carrying the cross-country traffic, while the smaller branch lines handled local and feed-in traffic. It was all part of a track-building boom, which tripled the length of the network over the course of the 1850s. The Pennsylvania Railroad was designed to connect the state's two biggest cities at Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. The route required them to build through the Allegheny Mountains, requiring some quite innovative inclines and tunnels, some of the first built in North America. At the same time, the Baltimore and Ohio finally reached the Ohio River it had been intended to access, boosting Baltimore's access to inland trade, but too late to stop New York's dominance. In New York State, the New York Central was formed in 1853 by merging 10 smaller companies who were stitched together to form a single continuous route, rivaling the other trunk routes. The Illinois Central was completed in 1856, running from Cairo in the south to Galena and Chicago in the north, connecting the length and breadth of the state. Upon completion, it snatched the Erie's title of the longest railway in the world. The Mobile and Ohio Railroad was conceived as a means of allowing Mobile to access the Ohio River, allowing it to rival New Orleans in the lucrative north-south trade it enjoyed along the Mississippi. It was completed in April 1861, just in time for the Civil War to block its river access. Nonetheless, it would play a big role in the conflict. Some were even expanding into Canada. The US and Canada wished to connect their networks across the Niagara River, but to do so would require a 251 metre or 825 foot bridge across the Niagara Gorge. Many designs were submitted, prominent among which was a tubular design designed by Robert Stephenson, based on a successful Britannia Bridge. But the winning design was submitted by John Augustus Roebling, who wished to build a suspension bridge. Many believed that such an idea would not work, as suspension bridges tend to bounce and sway, while railways need to be largely rigid. A previous attempt on the Stockton and Darlington Railway had been alarmingly unstable every time a train went over, requiring it to be shut after a few years. But Roebling believed he could make it work. He backed his proposals up with tons of intricate calculations, and was thus able to convince people to invest in his scheme. Charles Elliott Jr. built a temporary bridge on the back of several cables he trailed across the gorge using kites. Using this as scaffolding, the bridge was constructed over the course of 4 years, suspended from 2 huge granite towers. The final bridge spanned the gorge in a single go, 250 feet 76 metres high. It had 2 decks, with trains running on the upper level and road traffic on the lower. Roebling was admired for his ergonomic design. His bridge used a sixth the material required to build Stephenson's Britannia Bridge, despite being twice as long, and it was estimated that Stephenson's designs for a tubular Niagara Bridge would have cost 10 times as much. The first line in California, the Arcata and Mad River Railroad, opened in 1854, followed by the longer Sacramento Valley Railroad a year later. With the opening of the latter, travel fares from San Francisco to San Jose fell from $32 by stagecoach to $2.50 by rail, with a trip taking the third of the time. Freight rates greatly dropped too, stimulating growth, with farmers, miners, and loggers all benefiting from the line. Meanwhile, lines were extending west from the Mississippi, and calls were growing for a transcontinental railroad which would link the two halves of the country. A series of scouting expeditions were organised, plotting routes across the sparsely populated West. The government even orchestrated the Gadsden Purchase to acquire around 30,000 square miles or 77,000 square kilometres of land from Mexico, so as to give favourable ground for a southern route. But for the time being, plans were not getting off the drawing board, primarily due to political factors. The industrialised northern states and the slave-owning southern states each wished to spread their economic structures out west. Each wanted to be the one to whom the Transcontinental would connect. Fearing the other would use the line to hem them in, politicians on both sides worked to block any plan that would allow their rival to get the Transcontinental first. Of course, the South was lagging behind in rail building in general. Though there was a similar track building boom there in this era, it continued to be driven by small companies catering to local interests, rather than the long-distance rail movement of people and goods. By the time of the Civil War, the southern states could boast only half the length of track in the north, and no trunk routes running east-west. The population regarded the northern industry with fear and suspicion. Strong rail links could serve as highways for big businesses in the north to worm their way in, destroying their way of life and bringing dangerous ideas such as abolitionism. Their reluctance to embrace the railways would cost them in the war to come. That's not to say the North had a fully united network themselves. Companies, though larger, continued to build on their own island, with no American equivalent of the Railway Executive Committee to coordinate their efforts. There were a whole host of different track gauges in use, and much of their rolling stock was incompatible. Even where systems were compatible, companies were reluctant to allow their stock to travel on rival companies' lines. With no direct connection, passengers would have to transfer en masse where companies met, and freight would have to be transshipped, often to the other side of town, a process which could take days. But many were able to benefit of this arrangement. Interchange towns drew a roaring trade from the numbers of people and goods passing through from one station to another. When a stretch of track running from Erie, Pennsylvania to the New York border was re-gauged to allow for through running, the residents were so outraged that they formed a militia army and repeatedly wrecked the track, tearing up long stretches of it and destroying bridges. But one city would benefit from the haphazard way the network was built more than any other. Many of the rail projects in Illinois and beyond were conceived as a means of allowing strong connections to trade on Lake Michigan. The best way to do so was to link to the docks in Chicago. At the same time, the four main trunk routes were expanding west. Not wanting to encroach on the territory of the Western rail companies, they instead converged upon Chicago to link up with their main terminals. By the time of the Civil War, 11 different rail companies serviced Chicago. It was thus that Chicago would become America's main rail hub, forming the link between the eastern and western halves of the network. Though a few lines were built to facilitate the transfer of goods wagons, the people of Chicago were in no mood to lose their status as a major rail hub, and did little to encourage through lines to be built. The masses passing through the city every day were just too good a boon for local businesses. West of Chicago, lines were expanding, but faced a barrier in the Mississippi River. The many navigable rivers in North America were a common break in the early years of rail travel. Rail companies in this era typically favoured handling these obstacles with ferries, requiring passengers and goods to embark and disembark. In the winter, many of these rivers would freeze over, whereupon passengers would cross the ice on foot. But on occasions, temporary railways would be built directly onto the ice. It would of course be much simpler to cross via a bridge, but a number of issues stood in the way of building one. One was the practical issue of building such large structures. Ferries were typically much easier to set up in the short term. The Erie Railroad turned down an opportunity to buy the New York and Harlem Railroad, which would have brought it right to the heart of Manhattan, under the bizarre reasoning that passengers would enjoy the ferry ride down the Hudson more. There was the additional issue of pressure from the steamship companies. Publicly, they believed the bridges would serve as a hazard to navigation, but they were also unofficially keen to do what they could to limit their growing rival. While river traffic was still thriving, the rapid growth of the railways was encroaching on their business, especially now that railways were being built running in parallel to the main rivers. This dispute would soon come to a head. The Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific Railroad was opened from Chicago as far as Rock Island in 1854. A year later, they ran the first train in Iowa from Davenport to Council Bluffs. To link these up, they were building the government bridge across the Mississippi, using Rock Island as a stepping stone. The bridge was controversial, but not only because of objections from steamship companies, it also took on a political element. As Rock Island was the former site of Fort Armstrong, Secretary of Defense Jefferson Davis had a say in the bridge's construction. He initially supported the project, but changed his mind when it became clear that the bridge could serve as a jumping-off point for a transcontinental railroad which would favour the North. He called for the construction to be halted. He was backed by a number of prominent Southerners and by the city of St. Louis, the other site where the trunk lines met. They aimed to become the gateway to the West, but lacked a bridge of their own. They feared Chicago would take the title from them. But their objections fell on deaf ears, and the bridge was opened in 1856, 1,582 feet, 482 metres long, with 8 spans, including one rotating section to allow steamships through. Just 15 days later, a steamship called the Effie Afton collided with the bridge, causing a span to collapse on top of it. Worse still, the boat caught fire, setting light to part of the bridge in turn. This accident was most likely due to a stalled paddle wheel, but some historians have speculated on the possibility of sabotage. This was the first time the Effie Afton had been so far upriver, and opponents of the bridge organised celebrations suspiciously quickly. Of course, this is all just speculation. The steamship companies took things further by suing the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific, taking this incident as proof that the bridge was a hazard to navigation. It was built in a rapid flow area of the Mississippi, and its draw span was at an angle to the main current. Fortunately, the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific had a skilled lawyer defending them called Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wisely ignored claims of conspiracy, instead working to illustrate that the accident was down to an error on the Effie Afton's part. He personally oversaw several surveys of the area, which showed that the river currents were tolerable. He then passionately argued that it would be necessary to enshrine the rights of the railways to bridge the rivers if they were to be used to facilitate the settlement of the West. The jury was split down the middle. As the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific was the defending party, this meant that by default the steamship companies didn't win. They appealed this case higher, finally reaching the Supreme Court in 1862. But by then, Lincoln was president, and plans for a Transcontinental Railroad were in full swing, with the repaired bridge playing a vital role. Their case was brought to an end. Despite the narrow win, this case served to permanently establish the rights of rail companies to bridge the rivers, and signalled a clear shift in government policy away from the waterways and towards the railways. Lincoln well understood the power of the railway. In his election campaign of 1860, he made heavy use of rail transport to move from city to city to get his message to a much wider audience. He won the election thanks to a narrow majority in the northern vote, and made his way to the White House with the aim of halting the expansion of slavery into the West. To many in the southern slave states, this was unacceptable. So unpopular was Lincoln there that 10 of the states hadn't even put him on the ballot. The slave states held rapid referendums, where 11 of them voted to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States. When Fort Sumter refused to lower the Stars and Stripes, the Confederates fired on it, kicking off a civil war. A war that would show the world the full military potential of the railways. But that is a story for next time. Thank you all for watching. My main sources for this video were The Great Railroad Revolution by Christian Wolmar, The Historical Atlas of North American Railroads by John Westwood and Ian Wood, The History of the American Locomotive by John White Jr., and AmericanRails.com. If you are enjoying this series so far, please leave a comment to let me know, and why not like, share and subscribe to stay updated. I am currently working in the next video in this series, which will cover the American Civil War, one of the most interesting parts of their rail history, so do look out for that. If you'd like to support this channel further, you can leave a donation on my Ko-fi page or here on YouTube. Or for some cool accessories, you can check out my website and my Etsy pages for more of my artwork. There's also my merch shop where I have a number of t-shirts, mugs and posters available, featuring my drawings. There are links to all of these in the description below. Goodbye for now.